마음과 마음이 이어지는 사람 공동체, 안보 협력을 통해 아시아 평화에 기여하는 평화 공동체, 호혜적 경제 협력을 통해 함께 잘 사는 상생 번영 공동체를 함께 만들어가기를 희망합니다.
With the New Southern Policy, Korea has been working closely with countries in the New Southern Policy region, pursuing comprehensive cooperation based on the 3 Ps: people, prosperity, and peace. As an outcome, the trade volume has increased about 30% in 2019 compared to 2016, establishing the region as the second largest trading partner for Korea. The number of visitors increased by more than 50%, and the New Southern Policy region became the most visited destination among Koreans. Moreover, President Moon has demonstrated the importance of the New Southern Policy region through his visits to all ASEAN member countries and India in just 2 years and 4 months since he took office. In 2019, the Korean government successfully hosted the ASEAN-ROK Commemorative Summit and launched the first Mekong-ROK Summit in Busan, celebrating the 30th anniversary of ASEAN-ROK dialogue relations. In 2020, despite the challenges posed by COVID-19, the Korean government consolidated its cooperation with the New Southern Policy region countries by taking a leading role in initiating the special ASEAN Plus 3 Summit on COVID-19, providing medical supplies and equipment, increasing ODA for the New Southern Policy region, raising its contributions to ASEAN-related cooperation funds, and signing RCEP, the world's biggest mega FTA. Reflecting the changing strategic environment and new priorities, the New Southern Policy has been further upgraded into the New Southern Policy Plus, composed of 7 initiatives.
올해는 아세안과 한국의 전략적 동반자 관계 수립 10주년을 맞는 뜻깊은 해입니다. 한국은 신남방 정책의 비전과 성과가 아세안과 한국 모두에게 도움이 되고 있다고 평가하며 신남방 정책 플러스 전략을 마련했습니다. 신남방 정책 플러스 전략은 포괄적 보건의료 협력을 비롯한 7대 핵심 협력 분야를 중심으로 새롭고 실천 가능한 방안이 담겨 있습니다.
Comprehensive public health cooperation in the post-COVID-19 era. Sharing Korean-style education model and supporting the development of human resources. Promote two-way cultural exchanges. Build the foundation of mutually beneficial and sustainable trade and investment. Supporting rural villages and urban infrastructure development. Cooperation on future industries for common prosperity. Transnational cooperation for the fostering of safety and peace.
These are the 7 initiatives Korea will be pursuing as Korea seeks to build comprehensive and effective cooperation with ASEAN countries and India. Currently, we are faced with a common and unprecedented challenge. With the New Southern Policy Plus, the vision of which is to achieve a people-centered community of peace and prosperity, the ROK will continue its endeavors to turn crisis into opportunity for stepping towards co-prosperity.
한국 정부는 아세안과의 협력 관계를 획기적으로 발전시켜 나가기 위한 신남방 정책을 강력하게 추진하고자 합니다. 사람과 사람, 마음과 마음이 이어지는 사람 공동체, 안보 협력을 통해 아시아 평화에 기여하는 평화 공동체, 호혜적 경제 협력을 통해 함께 잘 사는 상생 번영 공동체를 함께 만들어가기를 희망합니다.
신남방 정책 발표 이후 한국과 신남방 지역 국가들은 사람, 평화, 번영을 아우르는 포괄적 협력을 증진해왔습니다. 그 결과 2019년 한국과 신남방 국가 간 총 교육 규모는 2016년에 비해 약 30% 증가하여 우리나라에 확보한 제2위 교육 대상국이 되었고, 상호 방문객은 50% 이상 증가하여 우리 국민들의 제1의 방문지가 되었습니다. 특히 문재인 대통령은 우리나라 대통령 중 처음으로 취임 2년 4개월 만에 신남방 국가 11개국을 모두 방문하는 등 신남방 국가와의 관계 강화를 위해 노력했으며 2019년에는 한아세안 대화관계 수립 30주년을 맞이하여 한아세안 특별정상회의와 제1차 한메콩 정상회의를 부산에서 개최했습니다. 코로나19로 힘들었던 2020년에도 아세안과 한중일 13개국 간 특별화상 정상회의 개최 주도, 방역 의료물품 지원, 신남방 국가 대상 ODA 규모 확대, 아세안 관련 협력기금 증액, 세계 최대 메가 FTA인 영내 포괄적 경제 동반자 협정 서명을 통해 신남방 지역과의 협력 기반을 공고화했습니다. 이제 우리는 코로나19 등으로 인해 변화된 국제 환경과 신남방 국가들의 새로운 협력 수요를 반영하여 선택과 집중 원칙에 따라 기존 신남방 정책을 7대 전략 방향으로 업그레이드한 신남방 정책 플러스를 마련하였습니다.
올해는 아세안과 한국의 전략적 동반자 관계 수립 10주년을 맞는 뜻깊은 해입니다. 한국은 신남방 정책의 비전과 성과가 아세안과 한국 모두에게 도움이 되고 있다고 평가하며 신남방 정책 플러스 전략을 마련했습니다. 신남방 정책 플러스 전략은 포괄적 보건의료 협력을 비롯한 7대 핵심 협력 분야를 중심으로 새롭고 실천 가능한 방안이 담겨 있습니다.
포괄적 보건의료 협력, 교육 및 인적자원 개발, 쌍방향 문화 교류, 상호 후회적이고 지속가능한 무역 투자 기반 구축, 농어촌 및 도시 인프라 개발 지원, 미래 산업 분야 협력, 비전통 안보 분야 협력 등 7대 핵심 협력 분야로 재정비하여 아세안 및 인도와 포괄적이고 효과적인 협력을 추진할 것입니다. 우리는 지금 새로운 공통의 도전 과제에 직면하고 있습니다. 사람 중심의 평화와 번영의 공동체를 지향하는 신남방 정책 플러스를 통해 위기를 상생 번영의 기회로 바꾸어 나갈 것입니다.
네, 지금부터 오후 세션
Let us
시작하도록
resume the afternoon session.
네, 저희가 이 한국 시간으로 쳐서는 좀 점심 시간을 1시간 늦게 잡았습니다. 저희가
We delay the lunch time
국가의 시간은
by considering time zone in your countries. Right now, it is 2:32 p.m. in Korean Standard Time. Let us begin session 2 under the topic of diplomatic and security cooperation between Korea and Mekong region. And in particular, we would like to talk about non-security matters. First, I would like to introduce President Kim Hyung-jun, Korean Association of Southeast Asian Studies, as a moderator. Please, Mr. Kim.
Good afternoon, I'm Kim Young-jin. I'm very pleased to be moderating in this meaningful seminar, especially the afternoon session. Traditionally, people, peace, prosperity are the key three pillars for the Korean-ASEAN relationship and Mekong relationship. Those are the issues that we've been relatively paying less attention, the peace or human exchange or economic relations, comparing with the various trends. The diplomacy cooperation has not been drawing much attention compared to other agenda, but as the pro-democracy movement erupted in Myanmar and the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar is gaining more attention from the world compared to other pro-democracy history in Southeast Asia. So in a sense, the peace, the agenda, the peace, the people and prosperity. The peace is people are the fundamental principles in this region. So today we are looking at what's going on in the pro-democracy movements taking place in Myanmar. We have 3 speakers who will be speaking on this topic for this afternoon. And the 3 speakers Busan University of Foreign Studies has invited very renowned and competent speakers. Professor Park Eun-hong has been studying Thailand, Myanmar, and Southeast Asia for the past 30 years from the comparative perspective about the politics. And the second speaker, Mr. Maung Cho, is based in Myanmar. So we look forward to his insight about what's happening in Myanmar. And the third speaker is a relatively new scholar. He has been studying Southeast Asia for a long time. He will share with us his insider perspective. Professor Hong will be sharing, touching upon the Myanmar issues that will be the main point for this session. So I look forward to very interesting and insightful presentations this afternoon. But I do have one concern that these 3 speakers have a lot to speak. I personally know Professor Park. I'm afraid that 30 minutes is barely enough for him to speak about what he has to say. So whether it's Minister of Foreign Affairs or scholars or everyone in Southeast Asia, many people must have a lot of questions to ask him. So once again, I'd like to remind you once again that each speaker has 20 minutes so that we can open the floor after your presentation to have the Q&A session. And share your thoughts with us. So Professor Park, please do make sure that you finish your presentation in 20 minutes. So I'd like to invite Professor Park Eun-hong from Songkonghae University. Are you here? Professor Park, are you online? Can you hear me? Yes. I'm very delighted to be invited to this important seminar. Thank you for inviting me, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and BUFS. Moderator, I'd like to also thank Professor Kim Young-jun, the moderator. And I can assure you, I reassure you that I will finish my presentation in 25 minutes at the longest. But first of all, we are facing such a difficult challenge, and I'm so grateful to all of you to have discussion with all of you. My topic is National Revolution versus Civil Revolution, the comparison between Thailand and Myanmar. And the cases will be centered on those 2 countries. In 2021, this year, the conflicts between Thailand and Myanmar will be dealt upon from the perspective of national revolution and the civil revolution. That will be my topic today. If you have, I will be using the term Burma, which is the same term for Myanmar.
제가 이 사용하는 걸 제가
I'm not quite good at the techniques, so please understand this. These are the contents.
지금 발표문이 있으니까 그게 제 발표 내용을 발표 내용이
These are the contents of my presentation today. Please refer to your program guidebook for more information. For more details, I'll be talking about civil revolution and national revolution, the conflicts and confrontation between civil revolution and national revolution, and the right-wing national revolution and left-wing national revolution in Burma, which is Myanmar, and compare this with the cases in Thailand. In both Thailand and Burma, in 1932 and 1962, the 2 years mark the very important historic point in the political change in those two countries. In 1932, Thailand, which was a colony of the Britain and France, but it turned to constitutional monarchy from absolute monarchy. And in 1962 in Burma, it saw a military coup that delinked itself from the world capitalist system. The civil revolution in Western Europe started based on the autonomy of the individual against absolute monarchy, passed through liberal or civil nationalism, giving birth to modern nations. And then they were transformed into conservative or state nationalism, restraining civil liberties of individuals, and finally came back to liberal nationalism. Capitalists at this time helped spread civil nationalism. Before the civil revolution, the legitimacy of royal family didn't come from people, but came from God. Back then, people were not citizens, but they were colonized people. And after civil revolution, they rebirthed into citizens, but colonial people still regarded them as the colonized people. This is the background that the Western powers saw many colonies, and it was the background where the nationalism emerged. In this chart, divides nationalism into official nationalism and popular nationalism. Those different concepts are based on the definition of Benedict and Ernest, the existing scholars on nationalism. As you can see in this graph, the modern nationalism's birth, the Western nationalism focused on state nationalism and liberal nationalism. This is regressive change from B to A, from popular nationalism into official nationalism. And the response to this was the militarization of civil revolution. A case in point would be France Bonaparte system and the Cromwell system in the UK. And this graph also shows that in this figure, the Myanmar and Thailand has experienced three-phased right-wing revolution or left-wing revolution and clash of civil forces, especially in Myanmar from phase 3. From phase 3, clash of left-wing NR versus CR, and was moving to phase 4. But in February 1st, it regressed to phase 3 with the military coup in February. And this is my claim. So, put simply, in 2011 August, the left-wing civil revolution the grand bargain between Aung San Suu Kyi and civil forces. But in 2016, with the launch of NLB, Myanmar has shown the possibility to enter phase 4, but with this coup military's coup d'etat has put the national revolution and civil revolution back to phase 3. Now, let me first begin with Thai's case. In Thailand, one of the initiators of 1932 revolution, Phibon Songkram, put emphasis on Latanium, which is nationalism for the sake of national unity. In this context, he changed Siam into Thailand, and Pridi, another initiator, also expected the national and constitution to be new objects of popular allegiance. Phibon Songkram and Pridi all resorted to state nationalism, but the military faction came to be absorbed in militaristic nationalism, a more extreme form of state nationalism. But Pridi resisted the fascism. So he became the nationalist, but after the war, he was defeated by Phibon Songkram, which colluded with the royal family. General Sarit Thanat proclaimed Thai-style democracy and resisted Western democracy. and he denied voting election democracy and prevented Western of impact, and the king himself put his best at establishing charismatic image of traditional Dharma Raja and set their birthdays as Mother's Day and Father's Day. And they also actively engaged in rural development projects. And King himself, King Bhumidol, stood in the center of official nationalism with the military and was protected by the military. However, in 1976, October 16, Thammasat University massacre took place, also known as Hok-Tulla, was the initial reaction of Thai right-wing national revolutionaries to the civil revolutionary forces in germination. So the Thammaratcha patience, it was a very significant case that Thammaratcha's patience was verified. In 2000s, the right-wing nationalist alliances colluded with powerful politician Thaksin Shinawatra. He implemented populism to rule rural areas and awakened the rural poor's political consciousness through populist policies and gathered footstones for liberal nationalism to possibly overcome the trinity of nation, region, and king. The military royal family alliance of right-wing national revolution tackled with a military coup in the name of protecting monarchy on September 19th in 2006. In 8 years, in 2014, in May, coup broke out. And again, the civil revolution forces and national revolution forces came in confrontation.
특히 2010년
In 2010, in April and May, after the red shirts demonstration, the confrontation between red shirts and yellow shirts was an entry into a prolonged and inclusive political struggle between right-wing national revolutionary forces adhering to state nationalism, estamized in the motto of nation, religion, and king, and civil revolutionary forces trying to break through the obstacle so that liberal nationalism can take root. In 2020, which was last year, young people led the Royal Revolution movement was also part of this civil revolution. Next, let's move on to Myanmar. In the 1930s, the term democracy to the young nationalists at that time was identical with colonialism or imperialism. To the young people, liberal nationalism that has formed the basis of Western civil revolution seemed nothing more than hypocrisy. So, as a backlash, they leaned toward Lenin's socialist revolution or fascism based on state nationalism. But during the Second World War, when Japan was ruled by Burma was ruled by Japan, there was anti-Japan movement, which sowed the seed for free democracy. The General Aung San back then announced 8 key pillars for productivity. It included the nationalizing the assets, which was different from Western free democracy. But as I told you, as the resistance to fascism grew, they became similar like free democracy. But as Aung San was assassinated in the liberation movement, the free liberalism and popular liberal revolution failed to bloom. In 1962, the General Aung San Maewin led coup d'etat, and in the midst of intensifying inter-ethnic conflicts at the AFPFL's intra-party dissension in 1962, a military faction led by Ne Win pulled a coup, advocating Burmese way to socialism. The military junta proclaimed a plan to establish a socialist economic system similar to that of Sino-Soviet bloc and organized Burma Socialist Program Party, which is BSPP. Ne Win ordered all the parties except BSPP to break up, and the government came closer to the communist voices. It became more and more authoritarian, suppressing scholars. Students began resisting. In 1962, the military shot students, killing some of them, and in 1963, when the demonstration began again, universities were shut for 1 year. In 1964, schools reopened, but students were banned from political activities, from social studies, but technical studies were only encouraged, which undermined educational level. The National Revolution government became more like fascism, abhorring intellectuals. The Burmese way to socialism was idealism oriented toward the anti-capitalist system through government control over production, exporting foreigners from their countries. About 170 foreign Pakistan people or foreigners were expelled, and the government began to control the infrastructure. The businessmen and technicians were all controlled. In 1974, in the middle of 1974, widespread demonstrations stirred up the country. In December that year, students of Rangoon University raised an anti-government revolt, making use of a symbolic opportunity of the death of U Thant, the former UN Secretary General and a renowned humanist. To put it simply, it was a challenge of civil revolutionary forces to state nationalism of the left-wing national revolution. And the resistance of civil society on the initiative of students burst forth for the first time again in 1988. Ne Win stepped down in the maelstrom. In 2007, the so-called Saffron Revolution, led by monks, the anti-government movement erupted, and massive protests led by monks against the military broke out, but the military suppressed, condemned their movement. Despite the Western resistant opposition, ASEAN also expressed their complaints, but in spite of the oppositions of the Western world, the Burmese military unconcernedly advanced its roadmap to democracy, passing the new constitution in May 2008, holding a general election in November 2010, and organized a parliament in February and launched the new government with Tien Shein, an ex-army politician, as head of the state in March 2011, but unexpectedly in 2011 August, the left-wing Revolution Force President Tien Shein and Aung San Suu Kyi had informal summit. From that meeting, the political struggle began between national revolution and civil revolution. The conflict seemed to end, and they implemented open policies. And finally, in 2015, NLD swept the parliament seats, and NLD and left-wing National Revolution Forces seem to live in peace and harmony, but on February 1st this year, the future of fairness and reconciliation is uncertain with the coup. So in conclusion, in Thailand, the right-wing national movement and Burma's left-wing revolution end up as favorable to socialism. It was inevitable to collide with civil revolutionary forces. So such being the case, both national revolutions grew to be locked up in a highly staffed position within official and state nationalism. How they reconcile will be the key in determining the future. The stability and peace and democracy of a country and the regional stability will hinge on this, and the Western history has shown that they are integral to peace. So the national revolution and civil revolution, the history regarding the conflict between those two forces must be the important agenda for ASEAN countries, and it has implications for many ASEAN countries as well. So as you can see in this slide, both Thailand and Burma, most important is the phase 4, where NR and CR must reconcile. The reconciliation between those two forces is very critical, and that is this time's challenge. And given the instability especially in Myanmar and also in Thailand, it's never stable politically, but if those two countries pursue peace and prosperity, then if you want that, then they must advance to phase 4 and realize that phase 4 is very critical. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park, and thank you for keeping time as well. The current situation in Myanmar and the situation in Thailand. To understand the situation, you presented us with some factors that we have to consider to understand the situations in those two countries. Maybe the next speaker, Professor Mao Tzu, must have lots of expertise and insights about Myanmar. But Professor Park has presented us with the backgrounds to better understand about the situation in Myanmar. Now let me invite Mr. Mao Tzu.
Under the topic of Myanmar crisis, 88 generations perspective. The revolution happened in 1988, and with his firsthand experience, we would like to hear more from Mr. Mao Tzu. Please. Good afternoon. My name is Mao Tzu from Burma. I am honored to participate in Korea Mekong conference, and I'm honored to be invited. First of all, I would like to introduce Myanmar or Burma. It is located in Southeast Asia. Among 6 Mekong countries, we are neighboring with Bangladesh, India, China, Laos, and Thailand. Also, Burma has various ethnic groups, including Kachin, Kaya, Karen, Chin, Mon, Bama, Ratin, and Shan, in harmony as a multi-ethnic group. We've had a lot of issues, but overall, the biggest challenge has been economy and democracy. Last October, we experienced a military coup, and today is 117th date since the coup. Citizens are opponent against the coup, and we've been protesting for the last 17 days. Let's get back to the history of Burma. We were liberated from the Britain and Japan in 1948. Between 1948 and 1962, it was the process of getting towards a democracy with a parliamentary democracy government. We've had a long period of military government, and between 1974 and 1988, the country was governed by Burma Socialist Program Party, but that was only another name of the military dictatorship. Probably, I need to talk about the protest. In 1948, we became independent from Britain and Japan, but in the course of establishing federal country, we already started the armed conflict for the independence of the ethnic groups. In 1962, we started a military dictatorship, and the civil war became more severe, and some citizens just couldn't take it. And after that, the civil war became fiercer. In cities, citizens called for democracy, and Arakan, Chin, and other various ethnic groups were fighting against military power, seeking for peace and prosperity. That has been fiercer since then, and the recent military coup also triggered that. And it has been over 70 years since we first sought democracy. And in 1988, we had a Quadruple 8 democracy uprising led by the students. In 2007, as mentioned, we went through Saffron Revolution, and that was led by the Buddhist monks. And this year, as of February 1st, there was the third military coup, which led to citizens' desire for genuine democracy. So I will say democracy, the movement towards democracy hasn't stopped.
버마의 가장 큰
Biggest democracy uprising was the 8888, and the recent 2021 Spring Revolution is as important as the previous uprising. Let me compare these two. In 1988, it was mainly led by university students. And that uprising was in line with the pro-democracy forces. However, in 2021, we have various stakeholders in the course of protest centered around big cities. Generation Z has been leading the revolution, along with city servants, civil servants, and ethnic armed groups also joined this Spring Revolution this year. And if you think about the suburban areas, the minor ethnic groups as the armed groups led the Spring Revolution. Let me continue comparing these two revolutions between the one in 1988 and 2021. There's a common area that these participants rejected the military power, and they had demands and the desires towards the democracy. And with these common areas, of course, we have some differences between the one in 1988 and 2021. Let me dive into those differences. First, let's think about demands. In 1988, the protest only rejected the military government and requested the democracy. In 2021, however, the participants gathered together with the rights for women, ethnic groups, minor groups, and peace. And these are the added demands by the participants of the revolution. Also in 1988, these participants fought against both the government and the military. However, in 2021, this movement only fights against only the military. How about the way they carry out? In 1988, there was a peaceful protest regarding the ways on the street. You saw people having peaceful protest in 1988. However, in 2021, we applied more methods of the movement. At the beginning, we started our protest as a peaceful one. Some workers didn't go to work to protest, and there were some social disobedience movement or CDM. And also there have been some movement to protect the citizens and to call for democracy by citizens, and we have diversified the various ways for the revolution in 2021. In 1988, ethnic armed groups didn't join the revolution, but that's the case in 2021. So you witnessed the participation with the citizens and ethnic armed groups. How about media? We didn't have any public media. We only had the government-controlled media in 1988. However, in 2021, we diversify more media channels, as well as social media and international media. Through media, the current situation is not only aired domestically, but internationally. So that helped gain interest and attention from the international arena. And of course, a part of it was the Korean citizens' support and their interest. In 1988, Burma was isolated without any international support. However, in 2021, we are gathering great support and solidarity from all around the world. Last but not least, let me add the perspective of international investment. In 1988, the military government pursued the Burmese-style socialist country and the economy. However, in 2021, we've drawn a lot of investment from many countries and many companies. And that's how we run our national economy. However, most of Burmese companies are owned or controlled by military government. So those companies were some kind of belongings of the military government. So we do have some common areas as well as differences between the uprising in 1988 and 2021 Spring Revolution. In particular, in 2021, we've improved along the way of democracy movement. With a lot of benefits, I would like to share successful points of 2021 Spring Revolution. First, we've witnessed the participation of women. A lot of women took the lead as a leader for this Spring Revolution. And I think this is the biggest change we have in Burma. Economy, education, cultural activities all stopped and the citizens are struggling. However, citizens share together, protect each other, and you can easily see these positive phenomena. And over 100 days, this has been the case. And I believe that is a driving force of this Spring Revolution. And I mentioned about ethnic armed groups and who participated in this 2021 Spring Revolution, and that helped share and protect each other. As you are well aware, Rohingya issue has been harshly criticized in the international arena. And through this opportunity, citizens want to create a new relationship with people of Rohingya. In 2021, we had an election and we were able to form NUG or National Unity Government with elected members of parliament. After genuine realization of democracy, we can take this as a stepping point to create a genuine unity government. Also, one of the successful points is interest and solidarity from the international society, and that includes South Korea, which give great support to Burmese, and I believe we will achieve the victory. In 2021, we do have some limitations against the despite the successful points. Of course, COVID-19 took in, and poverty and some medical conditions played its role. Also, inhumanity of the military kicked in, and citizens are enduring the harsh situations. And sometimes that's when military call suddenly happens, and that will only make citizens' lives harder. Poverty is another big issue. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And in health, education, economy, all achievements were brought down, and that made the citizens suffer. And I want to add inhumanity of the military. And since 1972 up to date, we can't expect anything from the military government. If you look at the history of the military government, everything they did was inhumane. And in particular, in 2021, we are going through the highlight and the peak of this inhumanity of the military. Reckless violence led to many people's death and casualty and wounds. Also, I have to mention about relationship between China, Russia, and the military in Burma. Burmese military government is well aware of the opposition of the international society. And they do care about what international society thinks, but also it's important for the government to think about the relations between China and Russia, because they firmly believe that China and Russia will support Burma. And the military government firmly believes that they can win and realize the victory thanks to the support of China and Russia. Next limitation is related to international investment. Trade and exchange can boost economic development, but trade and investment towards Burma will only make the military power strengthened. In 1988, we had this uprising, and since then we have increased international investment as we've been asking for investment from the international arena. It's about time again for us to ask for more investment internationally, and please do not disconnect your investment to Burma. Next item is about lack of recognition to national unity government. And I mentioned about the election, and with the elected parliament member and then the member of the armed groups of a minor ethnic group, and they're asking the unity and solidarity of Burma. International society has been backing Burma, although the military government was not officially recognized as the obstacle of the development of Burma. The only official government of Burma is National Unity Government. The military government by the coup is not legitimate and illegal. And there are some requests that I would like to ask to international society. Despite all the limitations and difficulties and obstacles, Please stand with us and work together. We should not neglect the inhumanity of the military. We need to pressure the military to stop the brutality, and we need to recognize national unity government as a ruling government. And we should stop the investment which is cooperated with the military and pressure China and Russia not to support the military of Burma. Last but not least is the message from the Burmese citizens regarding peace and prosperity. Let's work together for democracy and peace of Asia. Only when we can realize the democracy and peace in Burma, we can also realize the genuine peace and prosperity in Mekong region. That wraps up my presentation. Thanks for listening. And until we realize the genuine democracy, we will move forward. Thank you. Thank you. That was very convincing, but also very practical by comparing the situation in 1988 and 2021. So when you compare, you can see the common points and differences. And it was a great opportunity to realize that the 2021 revolution is quite different from the uprising in 1988. And your Korean is much better than mine. And it was very convincing. And I feel very humble.
I'd like to invite Professor Hong Moon-soo. We'll talk about the international relationship and development cooperation between Korea and Myanmar. I look forward to her interesting presentation. Professor Hong, please. Thank you. I'm Professor Hong of Busan University of Foreign Studies. I do understand Mr. Maung Cho must have great difficulty in connecting for this seminar, and it's very rare opportunity to have a person who are joining us from Myanmar. So I'd like to thank the organizers. I first visited Myanmar in 2008 and began ODA with Myanmar in 2011. So over the past 10 years, I like to talk about my studies and my publications, which were done by Korean ODA. So in a sense, I'm a beneficiary of Myanmar's democratization. My scholars before me largely focused on Myanmar and border area of Myanmar. They didn't have access to mainland Myanmar, but as Myanmar opened up, I got the permission from the government to conduct a large study project. So I was lucky in a sense. So literally from 2011 to 2020, I've watched how Myanmar turned into democracy and how Myanmar evaded poverty, and so the aspiration and hope of ordinary citizens for prosperity and the Myanmar people's capacity for peace and development. So I witnessed amazing changes myself. And for the past 11 years, the revolutions has failed and is facing limitations. So I'm very sad about that. So in that sense, today, based on what's happening in Myanmar, how we can talk about those issues in terms of Korea and Mekong region. But before that, today, I'd like to talk from some macro perspective. My PPT, first, COI, the images on my presentation are largely about CDM. So please understand that I'll be showing you the images in my presentation. the amazing democratization in Myanmar that has taken place recently, the transition to democracy in a society is very different, unlike despite theory. And that it does not happen just naturally or over time or overnight. For the past 11 years, Myanmar has been called the darling of the ODA, which attracted so many foreign aids, economic and diplomatic cooperation, both multilateral. A lot of cooperation unfolded in Myanmar. So what's happening for the past 117 days are very startling. New activities happened for the past 60 days, and coup broke out in about 50 or 60 days since then. The R2P, the UN's responsibility to protect, people are calling for the R2P to be triggered. But the international community must be thinking very hard about this, and the citizens are aggressively. The lawmakers who were elected in the general election, the GRPH, a kind of interim government has been formed. The CRPH has been active for the 30 or 40 days, and then NUG, which is National Unity Government, was launched. The NUG is led by Aung San Suu Kyi, and Aung San Suu Kyi is the advisor. So the elected officials will be the leaders, and the newly formed cabinet, most ministers of the newly formed cabinet will be the lawmakers from the federal government, and the vice ministers will be in their, some of them will be in their 20s, and 6 racial minority are from representative. So NUG comprises elected leaders. In that sense, it's a very meaningful organizations. NUG, Myanmar's people say no country has recognized NUG as the official government, but many international law makers are supporting NUG, and Korean lawmakers are very favorable to working with NUG lawmakers. I'd like to touch upon that later on. But the problem is, since the background, about 100 days passed since the Myanmar's coup, the UN's ASEAN, the international system between Myanmar and the UN is largely failing to intervene. But so people are raising the questions about the role of the UN for being so passive. And the international community's intervention has exposed limitations in multilateral perspective. So now the citizens are arming up themselves, and so they are facing the risk of seeing this situation evolve into multi-confrontation. So it's dangerous to define this as revolution, but to young people who are in the democratic transition, it's very dangerous to tell young people to use arm. We must not incite them to arm themselves. The last thing that we want in Myanmar is the multi-civil war. The balance of peace collapses, and many young people, if they migrate to forests, that must be the last thing to happen. But international community should intervene. There's something that international community should do. That is my starting point. For the past 3 months, we conducted many studies, and for Myanmar, what standpoints, what countries, international countries have many standpoints. Since the coup in February, many countries were aware of the move of the military since January already, and many embassies in Yangon they were already beginning to announce statements in January. Since mid-January, the International Committee knew about the coming coup from the second week of January. So we are studying the references since January 1st. I'd like to talk about two things. The crisis in Myanmar is involved in the US-China hegemony war. So it could evolve into a proxy war between US and China. But in a sense, it's right in a sense, but wrong in another sense. In 2018, scholar Han said that with the US and China competing for influence in Southeast Asia, how secondary states in the GMS region make their foreign policy choices has come under more scrutiny. It was a very interesting result. Actually, Thailand and Myanmar are in the conflict between US and China. And in the larger context, they are implementing survival strategy. One of the strategy is multilateralism and sub-multilateralism. Thailand is implementing multilateralism. Thailand uses multilateralism while Myanmar while Tamado implemented isolationism. And Aung San Suu Kyi was the leader who embraced China. So they are not very passive. They weren't absorbed to China's policies. And in the competition between US and China, Myanmar and Thailand are not passive countries. So given all this, the international relations for Myanmar, we are lacking. We have to understand more. Media today are bashing China, and I agree to a certain point, but as you all know, the One Belt, One Road initiative or China's other initiatives. To China, Myanmar is a kind of tricky country. Myanmar, it's not like China orders something and Myanmar follows. It's not the case. Since 2013 in particular, Myanmar's opening began and Myanmar, neither military and NUG, both of them wanted to embrace China. And since 2017, they implemented Look East policy, a kind of strategy implemented by Aung San Suu Kyi. That means the Western forces, it means that they cannot work with West, since they were not able to work with Western countries. So the last card for Aung San Suu Kyi was Look East. And Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand became more important partners. They had to work with China as well. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China, about 2.5 weeks ago, before the coup, the military leaders expressed complaints about the general election and the constitutional revolution presented by Aung San Suu Kyi, which was to be passed in parliament. The highlight of the amendment was the lower house, the upper house. The 25 seats will be reduced to 5%, but to military, it was unacceptable. So the military was so unhappy. So China's foreign minister, when he visited Myanmar, Minang Lai General Min Aung Hlaing was very active in telling him that the military will do its part. Given all these, we see some similar message. The key message is China has been in contact with all parties in Myanmar, and each stakeholders can solve their own problems, and ASEAN countries can help. So to China, whatever the stakeholders, China doesn't care whether it's military or Aung San Suu Kyi. The political stability in Myanmar is was very important to China. So to China, it left ASEAN do the job. But UK has a totally different approach. The G7 statement from the UK and the many declarations and statements from the UK, the drafts of them were all held by UK. The UK drafted all the statements and declarations. So the UK's parliament, politicians, and civil societies actively raised their voices about Myanmar. Especially the foreign secretary was very active. He even formed a team to respond to this issue. The newly elected Biden administration is very sensitive as well. The last card that US wants is that in Myanmar, China do not want the US expand its influence in Myanmar. So do China as well. So regardless of the governance is the top priority for the US. And for the US, US is working with the UK, implementing similar economic sanctions, updating new economic sanctions every 2 weeks. And the next strategy is coming up soon. So in this sense, but what's surprising to me is that the stakeholders, who are the stakeholders in Myanmar with the resources, then we believe it should be ADB or Japan, China, and Korea comes at the 7th or 8th. Then what about other stakeholders? Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand are the stakeholders in between, which have multilateral and bilateral economic cooperation, which are all ranked in the top 10. And traditionally, most influential, Japan has retained conservative position since the coup in February. On Feb 2nd, the foreign minister announced a statement, and other relevant agencies refrained from commenting about this. That means the civil communities in Japan don't have much of a response to Myanmar. That's in stark contrast with Korea. But given their influence in Myanmar, Japan is very important, could be very important in Myanmar, but in line with the G7 or vice ministers of foreign affairs, when they are in solidarity in statement, they list their names, but they don't raise their voices. So we have to wait and see. And for ODA's budget since 2022 were all canceled for bilateral, but this year's bilateral development was not canceled. I believe this is a very peculiar cases. For the bilateral ODA focuses on economic cooperation and diplomatic. Unlike, they focus on field. Most of the bilateral projects are pending, and so they are leaving that to other channels. So the positioning is not very clear for Japan. We have to take a close look. I like to skip the Korean part, but when Korea announced statement, I looked at it again, thinking whether it was from Australia, because Korea hasn't had raised voices before that. And I was a little, in a sense, surprised or glad by the response by the Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was in line with our new southern policies. That's because the civil society are also actively engaged in this process. Given all these complex multilateral conditions we have UN and ASEAN for multilateral framework, and also there are G7 and Quad. And Quad is not included in Quad, but India, Australia, the US, when they can raise their voices, the UN and ASEAN, I'd like to touch upon this later on. The UN and ASEAN, there aren't many for them to do. Individual countries are speaking aloud. Then what perspective should you have? Next month, UNDP will have a human security meeting, which involves Southeast Asia. The security issues will be dealt from the universal human rights perspective, and the regional issues will be dealt with given their specific characteristics. The Oxford LSE and Princeton scholars are all joining the conference next month. The key of the conference is freedom from fear. That means many countries around the world, as things worsen around the world, many citizens are not free from new fear. And the second agenda is freedom from the want. The things before the pandemic and after the pandemic, the multifaceted humanitarian crises are continuing, and the Human Development Index is going down, and poor countries are not doing their roles. This is not Cold War security, but freedom from poverty, freedom from hunger, freedom from food shortage, and recently, freedom from racial discrimination and policies. The community security and political rights and basic human rights, the rights to basic human rights. So going forward, up until 2013, as we discuss SDGs, COVID-19 is a good chance to talk about the humanitarian security. So given all this, there are new demands for human security and human development. Once the pandemic ends, the economic situation will get worse, and the countries from least developed countries to developing countries, they will fall again to least developed countries. If that happens, then what multilateral channels do, as many demands from many countries are rebuild the protocol from the 1990s to reduce the poverty and responsibility to protect R2P. will be demanded by many countries. This is not a legally binding declaration. It is not legally binding, but recently developing countries, especially those facing human rights issues, are talking about R2P. Advanced countries, this may be nothing, but to developing countries, this is the point where advanced countries can intervene. The R2P, which was applied in Libya, was not applied to Myanmar. It's included in the UN Security Council Resolution 19. UN Security Council Resolution. It was applied to Libya's. I believe it's case-by-case scenario. It's not settled in the international community, so the R2P is not applied to Myanmar, and the R2P's applications, the UN is not responding to Myanmar people's requests to apply R2P. So how can we view multilateralism going forward? Should we respect our multilateralism that isn't sufficient? The massive, heavyweight and political process which is required by the massive multilateralism may not work very well, then some more flexible and meso unit channel could play their role. So in that sense, the diplomatically mismatch exists. And the demand from UN is rising, but the UN's role are heavy, and Russia and China, it cannot pass US and China. Then we can seek multilateral or bilateral development, or development, sub-regional cooperation, and many other matching. Will that be possible? We have to think about that. So in that sense, the UK and US, the powerhouses, not just them, we have to look to countries with actual influence in this region. We have to cooperate more with some mid powers. So in that sense, our relationship with Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam should be strengthened because they can contribute to our foreign relationship. Given their massive influence in the Mekong region, we have to work with Asian partners by implementing soft policies. So in that sense, the multilateral cooperation has been led by New York and Paris. Then now we have to turn our eyes to Phnom Penh, to Chiang Mai. So in the sense, and for Korea, we have Asia Democracy Fund. This is one of the multilateral mechanism. So for ASEAN, there is a center in Indonesia. We requested that center to solve this issue. So we will focus on peace and education. The Mekong Institute, we can work more with Mekong Institute. Mekong Institute has a lot of projects going on, and it has lots of infrastructure projects. So we may think this is very busy institution, but they have a lot of new agendas, such as social cohesion and economic innovation and vulnerability issues. Those programs, there are no programs like this in the Mekong Initiative. Most of the Mekong initiatives have been developed with China. So the HDP, as implemented by the Korean government, those agenda may have to be integrated in those initiatives. LIDA in Thailand are very important. So we need to work with those international organizations. We can launch citizens initiatives if the democracy is very burdensome to us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Hong touched upon the things that we have to consider amid political crisis.
We're almost running out of time, but still it's important to collect some questions because some of the participants probably are eager to ask the questions, and I'm sure the presenters are ready to answer. And the floor is yours, including the offline and online participants. Feel free to bring up your questions.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저 외교부 아세안국의 정혜희 심의관입니다.
My name is Chung Eui-hae. I'm a Deputy Director General from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask Mangjo a question. And is it okay that I speak Korean? I have one question. You mentioned about 88 uprising, and you talked about a little bit of a characteristic of the military power in 1988. And what are some differences of the characteristic of the military government between 1988 and 2021? You talked about the inhumanity of the military government and like which one was more inhumane, or in terms of social and economic status, how has their status been changed? In 1988, we were under Burmese socialist system, and within the military government, we were pursuing socialistic way of a government system. And we had the protest first, and then we witnessed military coup afterwards. And in comparison, in 2021, we started protests and, sorry, it was the other way around. So the status quo started first in 2021, followed by civil protests. And in 1988, we had a military under the government, but now we had, I'll say, the official, so-called official leadership is under Aung San Suu Kyi, but this military is somehow regarded as a government, but I will say two different governments mutually coexist at the moment. So I will say the military government between 1988 and 2021 is greatly different. The highest person ordered military coup back in 1988, but this military coup just happened without anybody higher's order. So if you look both military power, I can't say, I will say that maybe it's worse, personally, I think it's worse of a military government in 1988. So if we think about Burmese changes, probably the citizens think that it's impossible to have a discussion with a military coup. So probably that's why we are protesting fiercely. Thank you very much. I would like to add more. Inhumanity of military government, I really mean it.
And any other question? Yes, Ambassador. Mr. Mangso, thank you for your presentation. I have two quick questions. First is, the ASEAN is very vulnerable in the international community about Myanmar. So is ASEAN able to have political will to resolve Myanmar crisis? During the ASEAN Jakarta Special Summit, after this meeting, I don't see any special measures by ASEAN, but is there any behind the scene activities in ASEAN? My second question is the international community. The Myanmar junta is interested in Thailand model. Thai in 2014, the coup forces won the general election. But why not us? Seeing the Thai, Myanmar says, why not us? Myanmar has upper house and lower house. The military has some guaranteed seats, so why not us? That's the question Myanmar junta is asking. So Myanmar junta is studying Thai model intensively and trying to introduce Thai model into their own, according to many people. Is it really credible? Is it really, can Myanmar junta introduce Thai model to their own? Thank you.
First of all, I would like to answer about the question of ASEAN. Before ASEAN's meeting, Burmese were really excited about the result, but after the dialogue, the expectation disappeared. And within ASEAN, we are more expecting from individual movement within the ASEAN countries. So it's not really about ASEAN, it's about individual member states of ASEAN. So democracy in Southeast Asia, maybe not an issue or interest of the ASEAN. So we do not really expect much from ASEAN, but maybe it will be more realistic to have more hope from individual ASEAN member state. And on television, we have some announcement from military government, and they're welcoming some ASEAN movement, but it's not a good time to visit ASEAN. And the government said that they will give it more time. Second, I would like to answer about Thailand. In 1988, when we had uprising, the model they were pursuing was Indonesian model. So we wanted to learn from Indonesia's case, and we made some efforts to learn Indonesian model. However, yes, you were correct on that. A lot of people are jealous of what Thailand has achieved, and then probably there are some things that we can learn from Thailand, but I don't think our military group is able or capable of learning from Thailand. And in terms of a civil perspective, we couldn't even catch up with the Indonesian model. So I don't think anybody is expecting that inhumane military power would be able to learn from lessons of Thailand. Also, through this democratic protest, first we need to do some capable building. In 1962, after the military coup, we no longer have expectation on military power, and that NUG still has hope, and they try to prepare something that they can learn from Thailand. So not only democracy, but the changes in military should be made before we learn some models from other countries. Thank you very much. We would love to listen to Mangju more, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So let me wrap up session 2 right here. And thank you all for your presenting and discussing and sharing great insights and your participation. And I truly appreciate it. And that's the end of session 2. Thank you.